Hello and welcome to Learn with the Lords Question Time. You're joining us today in the River Room in the Palace of Westminster, and we're thrilled to be joined by 4 members of the House of Lords, and in our audience 20 students from the Corby Sixth Form in Northamptonshire. So thank you all so much for joining us today. So today's event is going to be in 2 parts. We're going to start with a 30-minute panel discussion based on a question that will be very familiar to lots of you, which is the House of Lords effective in scrutinising the government? Following that, we're really looking forward to hearing your questions. We will have some questions from the students in the room and some from all of you that you submitted in the last few months. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our members to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into this discussion. So we'll start this end.
Hello everybody, I am Baroness Anderson of Stoke-on-Trent, otherwise known as Ruth, and I am the newest member of the House of Lords on your panel. So I've only been here a year, and I'm going to claim complete ignorance of every question and hand them over to colleagues. I am a Labour member of the House of Lords, and I am a shadow defence spokesperson and a Labour whip. So I have a front bench role here, and I am still learning my feet. But I also used to be a Member of Parliament until 2019 at the other end, the green end.
I'm Lord Hayward, Robert Hayward, a Conservative member of this House. I was previously a Member of Parliament for Kingswood in Bristol for a decade in the 80s and early 90s. I'm one of the people on this panel not called Anderson, but I specialise in elections law, elections matters, opinion polling, sport in one form or another, and LGBT matters. We like to speak on other subjects, but those are 3 subjects which many of my colleagues would expect me to comment on, because they're ones on which I concentrate.
I'm another Anderson, David Anderson, Lord Anderson of Ipswich. I've never been elected to anything since I was a student. I'm a crossbench peer, and I applied for my peerage by filling in an online form, completing a CV and providing 6 referees, a so-called people's peer, the sort that were introduced about 20 years ago. Most of my practicing life I've been a barrister. I practiced in the fields of EU law, human rights, public law, holding the government to account through the courts. I then became independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, so I got into the national security world, and home affairs, justice, national security are among the issues that particularly interest me.
And I'm Natalie Bennett, Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle for really formal occasions, but I won't count this as a really formal occasion. I'm one of 2 Green Party members of the House of Lords. I've been in here for 4 years, so you don't have to sit there wondering the accent comes from Australia originally. And I'm quite unusual in politics in that my first degree was agricultural science, and I think we need many more people in politics from a scientific background. And obviously, as you would expect, I do a great deal of work on the planetary boundaries. It's not just the climate emergency and the nature crisis. We've also made our oceans into a plastic soup. So many issues like that, but with only 2 of us here. I also do health, education, economy and finance. You might have just seen me doing a question on private equity and its role in the economy, and international affairs and defence. So you could say I'm quite busy.
Thank you very much. Right, let's dive straight into this discussion. Is the House of Lords effective in scrutinising the government? I'll hand over to Lord Anderson for some opening remarks on that question.
Well, scrutinising the government is what we specialise in. I'll give you 3 examples of the sorts of work we do. First, we question ministers and hold them to account. Now, who knows who the new Foreign Secretary is? Lord Cameron, David Cameron. He is appearing for the first time before a parliamentary committee tomorrow, and the committee will ask him questions. And on that committee will be former ambassadors, perhaps people who've been former Secretary General of NATO, people with very detailed subject knowledge of different parts of the world, whether the Middle East or Ukraine or whatever it might be. And the expertise we have here, I think, equips us well to do that. The second thing we have is subject matter committees, select committees or special committees that we establish. I thought this one might interest you. It was published yesterday by our Education for 11 to 16-year-olds committee, and their verdict is requires improvement, urgent change for 11 to 16 education. It'd be interesting to see whether you agreed with some of the recommendations. But these would be very thoughtful people, including former teachers, people who run universities, people who know about apprenticeships and what the workplace needs. And they've had the time to produce that. And then the third thing, which is what I spend most of my time doing, is we amend bills, draft laws that have gone usually through the Commons before they come to us. And I'm afraid, and I say this with deference because we have two former MPs here, I think the incentives for MPs in the House of Commons are not so much to spend all their time scrutinising legislation. Their incentives are to look after their constituencies, completely understandably, because they represent those people. And if they're ambitious and they want to get on in the world, then their incentives are in being very loyal so that they get a job in government. Now, I know they have committees in the Commons as well, and some people make a good career there. We, on the other hand, don't really have anything to do. Most of us are on our last jobs or getting on that way. Most of us are not ambitious in the sense that we want jobs in government, and we certainly don't have anyone we represent in the constituency. I think you could look at it like this. The House of Commons are like your parents. They're the people who make the rules. They're the ones who decide when you go to bed and who you can play with. I should say I developed this to talk to 10-year-olds about the work of Parliament. And they're in charge. But if you're lucky, as well as having parents, you will have grandparents. And the thing about grandparents is they're a bit older. Now, that's not true of everyone on the panel, but some of us are probably more grandparent age than parent age, it would be fair to say. They know things often that your parents don't know. And then most of all, they have time. They have a bit of extra time. And I think that's where we really come into our own. A bill is often rushed through the Commons. Very often it hasn't been prepared properly. The Commons is confronted with something really important at the last minute, and they simply haven't got time to look at it properly. And then the thing comes to the Lords, and the pace slows down, and everyone takes a deep breath, and we start reading it really carefully. And I think if you want to see whether we are effective or not at scrutinising the government, what I would say is look at the bills when they come to us, and look at the bills when they leave. And I defy anyone not to say that the bills are improved. And for me, that is really the thing that justifies our existence.
Lord Anderson makes a key point, and he referred to the former members of Parliament. Ruth and I have both served in both houses. And there's no doubt in both our minds, we were nodding furiously in agreement with what Lord Anderson was saying, that as far as we're concerned, the level of scrutiny in the Commons is poor. It has deteriorated in recent years for a series of quite good reasons. But the role therefore falls very much more heavily on the Lords to do the job of scrutiny of legislation or the behaviour of the government. And the Lords does it pretty effectively, but actually with little attention.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
So, agree wholeheartedly with all of that. When I was an MP, which wasn't that long ago, I never considered myself to be a legislator. I had so much work to do, and I worked 100 hours a week as an MP. I don't feel like I work much fewer hours than that as in the Lords, by the way, but still. But I had constituents issues. There was always a political drama, especially I was an MP from 2015 to 2019, so we had Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn was leader of my party. Trust me, there was always drama. So there was always something else that was a requirement of me. And the legislation that passed, that was almost secondary. When I arrived in the Commons, Harriet Harman was acting leader of the Labour Party, and she sat down the new MPs and said, "You are now the House of Commons, and this building across all parts is like a multi-act play, but all the acts are happening at exactly the same time, and you're going to dip in and out." But I never ever thought of myself as a legislator. Very few MPs do think of themselves as legislators. They think of themselves as politicians. A year in the House of Lords, I now consider myself to be a very poor apprentice legislator who will get better over time, I hope.
Thank you very much. Natty, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think one of the things, actually, it's really interesting. We're not really talking about the House of Lords, more about the Commons. But many years ago now, actually, I had a visiting German MP came here. And that German MP was absolutely astonished that British MPs did casework. The idea to a German MP that you would have, a constituent who's got a problem with their housing, a problem with the noise on their street, and that person would go to an MP was astonishing. In Germany, it was expected that the state, the civil service, the local council would sort that out, and that the job of MPs, if you were elected to Parliament, was to make the policies, to make the direction. But I would say that we have got such a dysfunctional state such underfunded, the impact of austerity, is that people go to their MP as a last resort, and that's a real problem with our system. But to come back to the sort of broader question, I mean, I broadly agree with what Lord Anderson said, and a really good example of this, if you wanted to cite it, was the Domestic Abuse Bill, now Act, in which there was a wide cross-party view across Parliament. What we were doing really previously, the law had really only dealt with domestic violence, and this was acknowledging that abuse can happen in many other ways, like through financial abuse, for example, and coercive behaviour, etc. And the Lords significantly strengthened that bill. There was a big cross-party effort. Lots of the female MPs worked together very clearly on it. Where I would say is that we scrutinise well, but do we actually act? When Lord Hayward said the behaviour of the government, what happens is if the House of Lords says this is the wrong thing to do, and then we get into ping pong where the bill goes back and forth between the two houses, and the House of Lords says, oh, well, we still think this is absolutely the wrong thing to do. And people then start to shuffle and shift and they go, oh, but we're the unelected House, so we can't overrule the elected House. And we let through things that broadly the House believes is wrong. And, you know, I'm sure we'll get more to this. That's one of the problems of our structure, is that the House of Lords doesn't ultimately stand up for itself, even when it really strongly believes something.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Thank you for those opening remarks, that's great. I think we should delve into a bit more detail the different types of scrutiny, if that's okay with everybody, perhaps starting with question time in the House of Lords chamber, and how effective you all feel that is as a form of scrutiny. Maybe Lord Hayward, I'll come to you first for that.
I think it's formal, which people may consider as not that detailed, because it's so much more polite than it is in the Commons. But remembering that the questions come from experts in whatever field, and when there are questions on the order paper, where I sit in the Lords, we'll discuss who we expect to ask the questions, because we know who in the chamber are the experts. So I think there is a good element of informed questioning. I do wonder at times what impact we have, because I'm not sure that this government or any government which concentrates on the House of Commons pays to the questioning from the Lords. So although the expert questions are there, I feel we could have more influence on a government of any political persuasion if certain changes were made, but I'm not going to go into those at this stage, but I'm a change addict.
Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think if you look at oral questions, and I know the pupils here from the Corby Sixth Form have just seen some oral questions, sometimes it is like that, and we do have the real experts standing up. But there isn't a speakers list, and you will very often notice if a man and a woman stand up at the same time, and both of them try and keep speaking, it will be the woman who sits down, not the man, even when she is perhaps more expert. And people will proudly tell you we're the self-governing house. So you will see this very odd situation sometimes when two people are both trying to ask a question, typically at the end of the session, and they're both standing up and yelling. And so it's not the Lord Speaker who decides who speaks. Half of the House start going, oh, that person, and the other half of the House starts yelling, that person. And I have to say, it doesn't look very good. If you had a group of 10-year-olds, you would wave your finger at them and say, come now, children, you can do better than that.
I tend to agree. I don't ask many oral questions. Where I think it can be useful is in identifying an issue, not a very big issue, but a self-contained issue that needs to have some airtime and that ministers need to prepare for. Because unlike in the Commons, where there is a culture, as one of our colleagues, Lord Norton, puts it, a culture of assertion, you know, it's enough just to say things and then how useless the other side are, we have a culture of justification. And although a question only gets 10 minutes, that's actually quite a long time to defend something that doesn't make any sense. So I'll give you an example. I was campaigning a little while ago for something that actually came to pass yesterday, at least in part, which is the ability for school children from other European countries to come here, even if they haven't got passports, using their national identity cards. We used to have it before Brexit, and it's so obvious that it's a good thing for 15, 16-year-olds to come here, see a London bus, you know, look around Parliament, you know, maybe come back here and study someday, or maybe come back here and work, or maybe feel just good about the idea of the UK. And I couldn't really work out what the opposition to this was, and we had all sorts of people coming in from different angles, and then the minister asked if she could see me, and we talked it over and what the possibilities were, and the press picked it up a bit, and I just felt it gave a shot in the arm to people who had been campaigning about this for some time. And so on that sort of issue, I think question time is useful, but I do think a lot of the questions, I'm sure Natalie's was great, I didn't hear it this afternoon, but I think a lot of the questions are a bit of a waste of time, to be honest.
I think one of the things that questions is really interesting for, and questions in the House of Lords, I think if you're a minister, would be a terrifying thing, because you have got, especially in my area, so defence, I think it's really important that women can speak with a level of authority, especially women from the left, on national security. But I recently took in a debate, but it would be the same in questions, and there were three members, three former heads of our military, the former head of NATO and two former foreign secretaries. If you're answering questions from those people and you don't know your brief, you are in trouble, and you're very quickly in trouble. And I think that that's actually the power that we have in our chamber. It identifies where the government are really struggling and where we can make them better. And especially because the House of Lords is much more collegiate in theory. It's still, by the way, one of the most political places, just everyone pretends that they're not as political, but that's fine. It's much more politely political than political. But what it does do, especially when there's a new minister, you can identify really, really quickly whether they're on top of their brief or not, and where the areas are that the government are struggling. And then experts come together in the House of Lords to say, I really think you should do it like this instead. And that isn't what happens at the other end. So I think it does make better government, but in quite a strange way.
Can I just add something in conclusion and agreement with Ruth, and that is that on the Conservative benches, we have a number of ministers who have been ministers in both houses, and they will all confirm that actually standing at the dispatch box is more daunting in the Lords than it ever was in the Commons, because there's just a confrontational brief in the Commons, whereas in the Lords, they're having to answer detailed, knowledgeable questions.
Thank you very much. Great insights there for everyone watching. So I think we'll move on now to discuss another element of scrutiny. Perhaps we've touched on this a little bit, but maybe delve a bit more into the process of scrutinising legislation. If that's okay, maybe Natalie, I could come to you first for some thoughts on that. How effective you feel that process is?
Well, I think one of the things coming perhaps particularly from my Green perspective, and the idea of introducing new ideas into politics, one of the things that people don't realise is that in the House of Lords, every amendment that's put down, and you don't need a seconder, you don't need someone else to support you, you can put down amendments to bills and they will be debated. Whereas down in the Commons and the other end, the Speaker selects maybe at most perhaps half a dozen amendments, and if it hasn't got broad cross-party support, it won't be debated. So for example, in the Environment Bill, now Act, I was able to put down amendments calling for the government to back the creation of an international offence of ecocide as a parallel to genocide underneath the Rome statutes. And I was also able to put down amendments about right to roam. So what we can actually do by putting down those amendments, we have that opportunity to start a debate on something that you don't have the opportunity to do. Caroline Lucas, the Green MP in the other place, doesn't have the opportunity to do that. So it actually, the bill putting down those amendments. But what I was also able to do with the Environment Bill, and this was the first time we've ever won a vote, a Green vote in the House, was we got soil added as a priority area with air and water. Now, of course, unfortunately, we then got ping-ponged and lost it down at the other end. But at least there was a real focus on the importance of soils to our environment that came through that work. And, we did have some promises from the government that weren't really fulfilled about paying more attention to soil. So there's real space, much broader space up here than there is at the other end.
Oh, that's a fantastic example. Thank you so much. Lord Anderson, if there's anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I'll give you another example. We had a thing called the Nationality and Borders Bill last year. And when that came to us, there was a clause in it that said, if the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, is going to remove your citizenship, which she does have the power to do if she thinks it's in the public interest, then she's allowed to do it from now on without telling you that she's done it. And I must say, I read this and I thought, what is this about? So I started off, I asked 6 written questions. We can ask up to 6 written questions a day to try and get out of the civil service some information about this. And I got the sense that maybe the person writing the answer to these questions thought I might be onto something, because sometimes the answers aren't very helpful, but these were extremely helpful answers. And then someone asked me to go on radio to talk about it. So I think I went on the PM programme and said, it seems a very odd thing. And, particularly for people of dual heritage, because it's people with 2 citizenships who are able to have their British citizenship removed. And people got quite worried about this. And Natalie described with domestic abuse how women from around the house got together. And I think there was something rather similar here with people of different heritage and people of colour. And Saeeda Vasi, for example, on your benches, got very exercised about this, and she helped organise a petition. 300,000 people in the end signed this petition, and people were saying, we thought our citizenship was the same as everybody else's, and now it can be taken away without even telling us. How do I know mine hasn't been taken away already? Not very likely in practice, because you've got to be usually a pretty bad person before anyone would think of taking away your citizenship. So anyway, the thing escalated. The Home Office was putting out more and more desperate press releases saying this was very exceptional power. I said, well, it doesn't say in the bill it's exceptional. So eventually I went to see the Home Office and said, what's all this about? And they said, well, we're worried we might want to remove citizenship from some horrible jihadi who's been fighting with ISIS, and now they're in a refugee camp in northeast Syria. And if we send a civil servant there to sort of tell them their citizenship has been removed, we're a bit worried their throat will be cut. So I said, okay, well, maybe you've got a point, but you don't need anything as broad as you've got. And at this point, this is why it's so good to have time. We had a few weeks. Somebody told me, well, this is how they do it in Australia, this is how they do it in New Zealand. They both had quite sensible laws. So in the end, the Home Office said, look, we're in a bit of a hole here. We didn't really think this through. We'd be happy for you to put some amendments down on the Australian and New Zealand model that would mean this is extremely rare. If it ever happens at all, it's got to be approved by a judge. The Home Secretary's got to sign off on it personally, etc., etc. So we ended up with a series of amendments in my name, which the government supported, that mean, I suspect, in reality, this is never going to happen again. And it was just a good example. It's not that we were particularly brilliant or anything, but we just had a bit of time. And we read the bill, and people out there in the country saw what it meant and started communicating their worries and their concerns and their anger to us. And then our job was to pick it up and channel it into government. And usually, we live in a polarised world, but governments are surprisingly still quite reasonable. And if you've got a really good point, then they will very often listen. And that's what happened in this case.
Can I just come in? Because I think Lord Anderson does himself a disservice. I think his level of expertise suggests that when he said there is something wrong here, the civil servants and the ministers went, oh, what have we done? And one of the things that is most fascinating about the House of Lords compared to, I think, any other chamber in the world probably, but definitely compared to our neighbour, our sister chamber, is during recent legislation, and it's been in the news in recent days about the Rwanda bill that we're about to have, but we've only just passed an illegal migration act last year, and it was one of the most extraordinary things to sit through and listen to, and not because of the emotive subject matter, and I come from a family of immigrants, so for me it was an incredibly emotive debate to sit through, but actually some of the most powerful contributions I heard were very, very, very senior lawyers, some of the most eminent human rights lawyers in the country, standing up to the minister and saying, this word in law does not make sense. This law will cause us to spend this word will cause us to spend hundreds of hours debating what you actually meant. There is no reason for this to be here. There is no reason, it adds nothing to the legislation. You need to take this word out. Now, I am not a lawyer. I had no idea that word meant nothing in law. I had no idea there were certain things that meant nothing in law, but it turns out he was right and the minister was wrong. But that would never, ever have happened at the other end. No one looks at legislation in such a way that goes through line by line, not to look at the consequences of the legislation, but the unintended consequences of the legislation. And that is what's most powerful, I think, about the House of Lords. And it is because we've got time, but it's also because of the genuine, extraordinary expertise of some of the people who are in the House of Lords.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Lord Hayward? No. Right, in that case, before we hand over for questions, I think there's one other really important aspect of scrutiny we've not discussed yet, and that's select committees. So perhaps I'll hand over to this side first, and perhaps we could hear maybe a little bit about committees in the Commons and the Lords as maybe a little bit of a comparison.
I've served on a number of select committees in the Lords. I've been a member here since 2015. The first one I served on was, surprisingly enough, elections law and the review of the malfunctioning of opinion polls. And we looked at the whole aspect of opinion polling, whether there was some systemic bias, whether it was intentional in terms of errors, what were the implications of it. We did it under the review of pieces of legislation that had been passed relatively recently, i.e. 5 years in most cases. And we made a series of recommendations. We didn't cover one area quite specifically, and it is an area that's of enormous relevance now because of all the attention on AI and the like. And that was the question of messaging through social media from foreign states and individuals abroad and their capacity to influence elections. The reason we didn't was because there was another select committee to pick those elements up. But it is an indication of how issues, you look at one set of issues and you suddenly realise that there is another set of issues that are linked and there is expertise there. And I'm an expert on elections law and opinion polling. I'm not an expert on AI, bots, social media and the like. So therefore, it was passed to another group of people. But do we do an effective job? Up to a point, because we've had an influence on things. But could we have done a better job? Yes, I think we could, by slightly changing procedures. And I would have quite a lot of view about some of the things I'd change. The other select committee I've served on at this end was a sports committee. And I was asked by a school group only last Friday, well, what's sport got to do with government? And it is a natural reaction. The first reaction is, well, it shouldn't have anything to do. But I just reeled off government policy in terms of funding of playing fields, swimming pools. At the opposite extreme, I'm very deeply involved in rugby. I've got my rugby referee's tie on today. And women's rugby, as with any sport, women's sports rising in terms of attention. Women's Rugby World Cup will be here in Britain in 2025, and it will be here because of a group of politicians of all parties and both houses lobbying the government because the rugby union needed quite a few millions of pounds to launch and operate the Rugby World Cup for women. So there's a whole host of different ways in which sport impinges on the state or the state impinges on sport. And that's certainly a field, and it wasn't just sport. We use the term sport, but we actually mean exercise because sadly 25 to 30% of the population and a particularly high proportion of females take no part in any form of exercise whatsoever. And that has massive implications in long-term health issues. So those are the two select committees. I found them fascinating. I've learned a lot from my colleagues because on the sports committee we had a general manager of a football club who's a member of the House of Lords, Karen Brady, West Ham. You had Tanny Gray-Thompson, disabled, Paralympian, international tennis player, Baroness Sater. You just went through the list. And they were the contributions that could be made. But we looked much more broadly than sport into exercise, and that was important.
Thank you. You did mention there were some things that you would change about the select committee process. Could you maybe just give us one of them? What one thing that you might do differently or you think should be done differently?
I think if there was just one, I would say that the government should be obliged to respond to select committees more quickly than there should be a time limit, because unfortunately governments prevaricate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other comments on select committees? Yes.
Could I give you an example, not through the telescope, but through the microscope, because it's what I happen to be doing this morning. It's really Lord Hayward's area more than mine. But in the Constitution Committee, we're looking at voter identification. You probably know that nowadays, when you vote, you've got to bring photo ID along with you, and there are certain sorts of photo ID, like a driving license or a passport, or some forms of travel card, for example, Oyster cards, if you live in London. But there are other things that are not permitted. And we were looking at the issue of whether other forms of identification ought to be permitted as well. And the government minister was there, and he had told us, we looked into all the others, and we decided that there was no point in adding any of them because they wouldn't enable more people to vote. So we were asking very detailed questions, for example, about young persons' rail cards. And we said, well, look at the people with young persons' rail cards. Did you ever do a survey to see what proportion of those people have driving licenses? After all, the clue might be they've got a rail card, maybe they don't drive, or they don't necessarily drive. What proportion have got passports? Maybe it's only 70%. In which case, aren't you expanding the reach and enabling people to vote who couldn't otherwise vote by putting those on your list as well? So they were tiny little questions, the sort of things lawyers like doing, picking holes in arguments. But sometimes there's a point in doing it, because you might just expose the fact that someone hasn't quite done the job properly, or they haven't looked at it in the way that they should have done. And I don't know what we'll conclude because we haven't produced our report yet. That will come out early next week. But I think it's good that someone has looked at this anyway. When you're looking at something as important as the right to vote, and you're looking at some people, perhaps a very small number, but some people who can't vote because they don't have that photo ID and don't know what else they can do about it, I think it's really good to have that scrutiny. And I agree, you used the word influence. I think we do have influence, we don't have power. And I'd be all for any changes that require people to look carefully at what we've said, because the problem with too many of these reports is that they sit on shelves and don't get implemented.
Just to add one point in addition to that is that the House of Lords committees do really interesting reports. One that's coming out shortly is one on the use of artificial intelligence in lethal autonomous weapon systems, killer robots for shorthand. And that will be a really authoritative report on that subject. So if you're doing a project at school or university, that's something that you could look back over those special reports. That's a real resource that you can use as an authoritative source that would be a really useful thing to look at. We're going to have one coming up the next year on ultra-processed foods and whether they should be regarded as a category and how they should be treated by government policy. So there's lots of really useful resource there, the sort of testimony we've been hearing about that you could draw on for work you're doing in the future. And I will just also say that one of the things that I find a little frustrating from my perspective is there's an allocation of three government, three main opposition, 2 Lib Dem and 2 crossbench. There is no allocation to the committees for what are known as the non-aligned or smaller parties. And that's an increasing group of members of the House of Lords, which is something I'm working on.
Thank you very much. Right, I think we'll conclude the discussion there and we will hand over for questions, everyone. I will start with some questions that have been pre-submitted, though, to give you a couple of minutes to think, okay? So we'll start with one submitted by Perth College and Rosedale College in Hillingdon. So thank you very much for this one. In your opinion, does the House have sufficient power to perform its functions and successfully hold the government to account? So we've touched on this, but I'm interested in the sufficient power section. So I'll hand over to Lord Anderson for some thoughts on that one.
I don't think we really have power. I think we have influence. And if you want us to stay as grandparents, then I don't think you want to give us power. You don't want grandparents deciding what happens to the children. If you want to give us power, then I think you're looking at a very different constitutional settlement. Natalie says that we defer to the Commons because they're the elected House. Yes, we do. And I'm afraid I think it's right that we do that. We do not have legitimacy of having been elected by the people. And so if we get into a head-to-head fight on a political issue and they refuse to listen, then I think it's right that we give way. Now, you could make us elected as well, and that would certainly make us more powerful, But would it make us better at scrutiny? No, I don't think it would. I think it would make us worse at scrutiny, because as soon as we're elected, then our members have all the incentives that elected members have in the Commons. They need votes. They need to pander to people, not do what they know as experts is necessarily right, but what they think might win them the votes. Or it attracts people who are still ambitious in party politics and find that the House of Lords is a good way of achieving those ambitions. So I think be careful what you wish for. You could make the House of Lords more powerful, but I'd rather stick with the influence that we have.
Thank you very much. Right, we'll move on to a question from the Manchester Grammar School, and this one's for Lord Hayward and Baroness Anderson. Could you please provide a recent example of when a peer put forward an important amendment to a government bill and the government accepted it?
So nothing is as straightforward as that, unfortunately, and as already been discussed, you have to be quite persuasive and quite determined. But I have a wonderful colleague called Baroness Merron, Gillian Merron, who also used to be an MP, and she is now in the House of Lords. And she was the lead for the Labour Party in the recent online safety bill, now the Online Safety Act, about what everyone gets to see online. And there was a gap in the legislation about animal cruelty. So although we were stopping people from being able to see lots of, putting restrictions on a lot of content online, you were still going to be able to see appalling acts of animal cruelty online in terms of videos, like really, really graphic, detailed, horrendous things. And the government would not close a loophole in there to allow that to come through. Gillian ultimately managed to convince the government, after a vote of the House, that the government maybe needed to think again. That's now been adopted. It's in the legislation, it's on the face of the legislation, and it means that animal cruelty videos are also have to be removed online in the same way that graphic child abuse or other videos. So we're talking about the really graphic things that that no one really wants to see online, I hope. And it's now in the same category. So that was an incredibly important part of legislation that was done last year.
I have a slightly different example, and it's a case of where this House, the House of Lords, actually worked with the House of Commons. I was trying to find a way. There was an anomaly in the legislation on same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage was allowed in England, Scotland and Wales. It was not allowed in Northern Ireland. And so I was trying to find a way of changing the law in relation to it. And the clerks in the House of Lords said, do you realise that Conor McGinn, who is a Labour MP in the House of Commons, is trying to do exactly the same thing? Would it be all right if we put you together? And we got on like a house on fire, great friends as a result of that. We then had the problem of trying to find a piece of legislation because the government wasn't going to find time for it. So what we finished up doing was attaching it as an amendment to a piece of government Northern Ireland legislation. And it worked. The government agreed that they would accept the amendment. It still remained a private member's amendment, but Conor McGinn took it through the House of Commons, and I took it through the House of Lords. And it was a fantastic experience. I was allocated by the government, civil servants and lawyers, to give me assistance to do it. But it is both an indication of a way that a peer can change the law and also way both houses and both major parties working together can achieve a piece of legislation.
Fantastic, two great examples there, thank you. Right, Corby Sixth Form, it's over to you. Who has a question that they would like to put to our panel? Yeah, go for it. And if you'd like to decide who you'd like to put it to as well, that's also fine.
I kind of want to aim this at everyone. How important do you think it is that we have women in the House of Parliament?
Good question. Who would like to open?
Was it women?
Women,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh my God. Where should I start? How important? It's incredibly important. If I tell you that since women got the right to vote, there have still only been 563 women elected out of 650 in every parliament. In our history as a country, there have been more men called John elected to parliament than there have women. So it is so incredibly important, and it's not just important because representation matters, but it does. But it's also important because of what women deliver when they're in Parliament. So if you think about someone, and I'm very grateful, and most of the work I've ever done has been with people, with men and with women, and with people who represent different communities and different classes. And if you want to get anything done in this building, you need to build a coalition. But there are certain things that are more important or that women will think about. So when I talk about national security and women, I think it's really important that someone asks, when we're going to deploy the military to the desert, have we sent the right clothing with them? And I'm not sure that men always ask that question in the nicest possible way. But there's other things too, like the first piece of planning legislation, which sounds really boring, right? But planning's really important. And there was a woman MP in the 1930s who said, when you're building social housing, it'd be really a good idea if we had kitchens and bathrooms, and that they were minimum sizes, because obviously it was going to be women that use kitchens and bathrooms. I mean, I hope everyone was using the bathroom, but you know what I mean. So it's the different types of legislation and the different priorities that you might think about. Everybody on this panel will think absolutely, completely, I hope, or we're all going to fall out, but equal pay is a really good, is a given in British society, that men and women should get paid exactly the same for the same job, except that doesn't happen in British society yet. It's been legislated for, we've got cross-party consensus, but we're still 40 years off delivering equal pay the rate it's going for men and women in British society. So it's making sure that people like me, and much more importantly than people like me, people like you, the women in the room, stand for election at every level to make this right. Because your voices, all of your voices, are incredibly important. He's about to disagree with me, but that's fine. Because this is about you. Now, every piece, including women getting the vote for the first time, men voted on that. It was men that had to deliver it because we weren't here. But when the women first arrived in 1919, their casework, they were the first ones to have ludicrous amounts of casework. Their casework came from women up and down the country because for the first time, they felt that they could ask things. And I would say, when I was the only woman MP in my area, and other women would come to me from across my city, because there were things that they could talk to me about that they didn't feel comfortable talking to their male MPs about, and that's why it matters.
I indicated, while Ruth was speaking, that I was going to disagree, only because I disagree with the basic tenet of the question. It's not just whether there are women representation, but it's a question of ethnicity, disability, and a whole range of other things. When I took students around building this morning, I made the observation that for disabled people, this building is an utter nightmare. And if our legislature is a nightmare for disabled people, then the probability is that the outside world is a nightmare for disabled people. So all I'm saying is, in saying I understand the question about women, but I think the question should be much broader, and should Parliament therefore be representative, far more representative. And again, when I took the students round from Corby, I made reference to a very good friend of mine who comes here to eat on reasonable number of occasions. He's of mixed race, and he sits in the peers' dining room and fumes about the number of white men that there are in the place. So it's not just women.
There's lots of white men.
It's a much broader issue in terms of representation of society.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just tack on the question from Blackheath High School in London, because they'd like to know how the House of Lords is combating the gender imbalance in the chamber. I wonder if I could just drop that in as well, Natalie.
Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is put in an advert for a wonderful organisation called 50/50 Parliament, which is working to get exactly that, particularly focused on elections in the lower house. So I'll get that advert in. And I'm going to agree with the two previous speakers, actually, in the sense that, yes, I think we should be absolutely representative. And one of the problems with the House of Lords is we have 92 hereditary peers who are all here because of who their father is, and they're all male. And while we have hereditaries under that position, we're not going to get to an equal numbers in the House of Lords. But I think obviously people from black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds are grossly underrepresented in both houses. People with disabilities are grossly represented. There is also a huge problem with age. The average age of the House of Lords is 71. And I very much believe in votes at 16. In fact, I'm talking to the Young Greens about taking our policy to votes even younger than that. And I think we should have 16, 18, 20-year-olds in both houses, because what you are absolutely an expert on is what it's like to be a 16-year-old now. There is no one in the House of Lords who has the faintest clue what it's really like to live life as a 16-year-old now, which, you know, when you think of what you've been through with COVID, with the technological world we live in now, we really need broad representation of the people in British society, and what we have here now is very, very, very far away from that.
Thank you. So we'll carry on with the theme of House of Lords membership, I think. And this question is from Emmanuel School in Battersea and Sir Joseph Williamson's Mathematical School in Rochester. And they'd like to know if you think the House of Lords appointments process is as robust as it could be. I might hand over to you for this one, Lord Anderson. Is that okay?
I think I've indicated in earlier answers that the House of Lords in our current system is indispensable. I also believe that the appointments system, if you can call it that, is indefensible. And it is a miracle that our output is of such high quality when our input is frankly so variable. I completely agree with Natalie about the hereditaries. You cannot justify putting people in this place on the basis of what their fathers and grandfathers did, particularly when they're all male. Now, some of them actually are annoyingly good, but I have no fears for them. If they're that good, then they can get in through any meritocratic process. So I would certainly get rid of them. I think the political patronage is a disgrace. You know, people get into this place because they have given large sums of money, I'm afraid, to a political party. People get in because a prime minister on a whim thinks it will be amusing, to put somebody in, maybe who was a sports star of their youth or had some sort of glamorous profile. And that's very bad for the rest of us, because if anyone politically wants to run down the work we do, then all they have to do is point to some of the more absurd appointments and say, well, how can you trust that bunch of cronies? And so I'm very strongly in favour of reform. What would I do? Well, I think there's one very simple thing you could do. There is a House of Lords Appointments Commission, and I'm one of these very unusual people that was recommended by that commission, so I wasn't here because anyone sort of recommended me by way of patronage. But at the moment, all that does is it looks to see whether someone is a fit and proper person. So if they're not paying their taxes or they've got a conviction for fraud or something, then the Appointments Commission can say, well, actually, Prime Minister, we don't think that's a very good idea. And actually, I'm afraid there's been one example of the Prime Minister saying, well, I don't care what you think. This is Boris Johnson. I'm going to put him in anyway. So I give it much more teeth. I'd put it on a statutory basis, and I would give it the power not just to look at whether people are fit and proper persons, but whether they are suitable to contribute to the work of the House. At the very least, there should have to be a statement explaining exactly what it is about this mystery person who's just arrived with us that justifies them in taking a part in making laws for the nation. And I would take it further by actually giving this commission a proper scrutinising power that it doesn't have at the moment. And I think that will be it'd be a very modest reform. I mean, you can think of far more dramatic things to do in terms of reforming the intake of the House of Lords. But I think introducing that element of scrutiny would make Prime Ministers think before they abused their power of patronage. And I think it would improve public confidence in the quality of people who sit in this place.
Thank you very much. And that touches on Cambion Wilfell School in Kendal, your question about whether hereditary peers should stay in the House of Lords. So I think at this point we will go for another question from Corby Sixth Form. So who go for, we've got two, marvellous. So we'll have you first and then we'll go to Skylar. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Today we spoke about how the House of Lords holds the government accountable, but what's in place to hold the House of Lords accountable?
Ooh, who would you like to put that one to, Billy? Does it matter?
Just to the whole panel. The
whole panel, wonderful. Right, who'd like to come in on that one?
The answer is we aren't held accountable, but the point that David Anderson made just now about trying to get our message across about what we do well is obliterated by the criticism of who we've got in here and how many there are of us. And if those two major arguments, we then come to the question of age and representation as well, if those were moved away, then the work that's done by the select committees and by the questioners in the chamber or wherever would actually then be considered more seriously by the other house, by civil servants and the public at large. And under those circumstances, we really would be held accountable. But at the moment, I'm afraid, we're not adequately accountable for a whole series of reasons.
Can I just agree with that, but also say, I mean, we've been doing the House of Lords down, and I would entirely agree with all the criticisms that we have made, but also we still have the strange situation where the House of Lords is more representative of the country than the House of Commons is. Because down in the House of Commons, the last general election, 2019, Boris Johnson got 44% of the vote and 100% of the power. Most people did not vote Conservative. And yet the Conservatives can still, as we saw last night, get anything through the lower house. Here in the House of Lords, still, the crossbenchers, people like Lord Anderson, the people who have been appointed for their own merits, they actually have the balance of power. If the crossbenchers join with all of the opposition parties, they can vote down the government. So, I would say all of this is a function of the much greater problems with our archaic, assembled by accident over centuries, uncodified constitution that means that, essay question to discuss, the UK is not a democracy, and the House of Lords is just one of our many problems in terms of the structure of our constitution.
Just three very quick answers to your question, not complete answers. First of all, is a register of interests, which is pretty strict. And if we have interests in anything, whether financial or non-financial, that might have a bearing on our work, we have to declare those, and we can be judged against them. Our voting record, again, there's a great website, They Work For You, that will analyse for each of us how we voted on every issue, and we can be held accountable for that. I certainly get a lot of letters, I'm sure Natalie gets many more, from people taking issue, why did you say this, why didn't you say that? Then the third thing is television. I mean, Parliament Live TV, if you're really interested in my evidence sessions on voter ID, you can watch them in exhaustive detail, and they're 3 hours each, and they're there on Parliament Live. And so if we do anything really stupid or really corrupt or really improper, then at least to the extent it happens in committee or it happens in the chamber, it's there on film. So those are partial answers. Another answer is that ultimately, everything we do is subject to the Commons. We have the influence, but they have the power. And if we've gone off our heads and done something stupid, then it's perfectly open to them to tell us we were wrong.
Yeah, I just, for the record, we are a democracy. I just want to make that very, very clear, just not in the House of Lords. The one thing that is quite extraordinary about the House of Lords, and actually Natalie touched on it earlier, some of it I find really odd, but the self-regulating nature of our chamber isn't just about who asks the next question. We also are self-regulating. And I talked about the eminence of some of our members. Some of these people I find completely terrifying. Like, truly, they are extraordinary brains. When I first arrived, I thought I was sitting through something called a Reith lecture, which happens it's happening right now on the BBC every day, because you're listening to people who are just world-leading experts in their field. And I'm very young in here. It's going to be very good for my ego for a little while. But there are times when you go, oh my God, that is just, this is intellectually challenging and stretching in a way that is a joy and a privilege to listen to.
Thank you. So we'll come to your question in a minute, Skylar. We'll just take a few more from schools that are watching. So this was a really popular question from Birkenhead Sixth Form, Harris Invictus Academy in London, Shenley Brook End School in Milton Keynes and Croydon College. And they would like to know whether the House of Lords should become an elected chamber, and would this strengthen its ability to scrutinise legislation? Has anyone got any initial thoughts on that? Maybe Natalie, would you like to
I've come back because, of course, Lord Anderson has already presented his view on this. I think it should be an elected chamber. I think the UK should be a democracy. But I think it's possible to elect it in different ways to elect the Commons. So, if, for example, the first thing I did after my maiden speech was trotted up to the Bill office with the House of Lords Elections and Other Reforms Bill. And what that includes is 10-year terms. People would be elected using the European constituencies because they were previously drawn up. People would be elected for one 10-year term. You were not allowed to be re-elected. You were not allowed to then go down to the House of Commons. So it wouldn't be a place where you could set up a political career. And it was structured in a way that would really encourage the crossbenchers, the non-party people, to actually set up a list of their own. And if you take the example of my native Australia, we have a Senate, an upper house that's elected by proportional representation. The lower house has the alternative vote system, which is often actually less proportional even than first past the post. And people vote very differently for the upper house to they do for the lower house. Voters actually understand that this is the house of scrutiny. The Greens have always done very well in the upper house in Australia. We've only recently started to win seats in the lower house. So people will go into the polling station and vote one way for the House of Commons and vote a different way for the House of Lords, acknowledging that this has a different job. And I think the electorate can understand that very clearly.
Thank you. Have we got any other comments?
I would disagree strongly. I'm with David Anderson in relation to it. And I disagree with Natalie that having served here, served in both houses, we perform different roles. We require different people to perform those different roles. And under those circumstances, if we were elected, although there are ways round it and different perspectives, as far as I'm concerned, we would rapidly get into a position of, well, my mandate is better than yours because it comes on a different, ours is more recent than yours. We have an equal mandate, and under those circumstances, we're going to go head on. I think with very, very substantial reforms of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, we should be able to operate a bicameral system with one House elected and one House appointed, because they should be on merit in the Lords, as what David Anderson's already identified. Conspicuous merit is the phrase in Lord Norton's bill, which many people in this House of all parties subscribe to.
I just say I agree with that. There is, you see politicians a lot, or at least I hope you do. I hope occasionally you might see your local MPs or councillors. They have a job of work to do to get elected repeatedly. And you see it, if you watch one debate, most people don't watch a full questions under a statement in the House of Commons. But if you want to have this conversation about whether politicians change their behaviour when they're elected, you want to watch a full question time to the Chancellor. It will be an hour and a half, 2 hours on the budget, because he'll have to answer the same question 20 or 30 times. It'll be slightly different worded, but it'll be exactly the same question, because that Member of Parliament needs that 30-second Facebook clip for their constituents to make it look like they were the only ones that asked that question, right? That's what that is. It's performative. Whereas in the House of Lords, on exactly the same issue, what you'll have, and we had it yesterday on the National Insurance Taxation Bill, was people asking, well, can you explain to me what percentage of income is going to change from that, and how much is the NHS going to get from that? And no one will ask the same question, because everyone will look at you like you've done something like the self-regulation bit again. They'll look at, were you not listening? Were you not paying attention? But also, no one cares for that 30-second Facebook clip. And I think that's incredibly rewarding, because we hear a great deal about the power dynamic between the Commons and the Lords. But if I had my own elected mandate, I'd have my own elected mandate, and no one would tell me that I was wrong.
Thank you very much. Right, so we'll move on to a question that we've touched on a little bit about diversity in the House of Lords. And this is a question from Hyams Park School in London and Rainford High Technology College in St Helens. And it's how the House of Lords can be more representative of other religions and ethnicities. Because we've talked about how the House of Lords isn't quite representative yet, but how can that be achieved? Who would like to come in on that one?
shall I elaborate on what I said just
Please
now?
do, yeah.
And that is that you do give, as David Anderson suggested, more powers to the Appointments Commission. You would give them a specific role in terms of targets, etc. I'm not in favour of complete kind of, it must be all women shortlists, or you've got to have set percentages, but there should be an acknowledgement of a need for diversity in a full range. And therefore, if you do that, then you can achieve what we've discussed earlier up to an extent. But I would never set down certain percentages. And to some extent, I will disagree with what Natalie said earlier in relation to ages. Because we are a house of experts, conspicuous merit does result in people being, on average, of an older age category. And that is probably the one area in which I'm afraid I'm saying, and I'm conscious I'm talking to an audience of younger people, but people have to recognise the downsides of policies that you advocate, and I'm recognising the implications of what I'm saying.
I've met some great members of the Youth Parliament. But I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet was, of course, we have 26 Church of England bishops. And that's something that I think should be mentioned on the record in this. And that is in no way representative of the religious affiliation of the country, and whether there should be religious people at all is one question. But I think the fact that we only have formal representatives of the Church of England is utterly indefensible in 21st century Britain.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we'll come to our third question from Corby Sixth Form.
What do you think the biggest flaw is with the House of Lords? And that's, again, to everyone.
Okay, great. Biggest flaw of the House of Lords. Who would like to come in on that?
Well, in 2 words, it's the appointments process. We've discussed some of its defects and some of the ways it might be improved. I think the work we do is very good, but the way we are composed can't seriously be defended. And that's what we need to reform first.
2 quick observations. One is the numbers of us. There are far too many, and we have to be reduced rapidly. And secondly, can I say that all of Ruth's life experiences that she's just identified, including her becoming a Labour MP and a Labour peer, emanate from the fact that the first visit to this beautiful building she refers to was she came to visit this building as an 8-year-old, and she was brought round by her Member of Parliament, who happened to be me. And she got turned off the Tory party by being with me, but turned on to the building because she was given such an excellent tour.
It was a very good tour.
And that covers the question from Balweary High School in Kirkcaldy, so thank you for that. So we'll move on to a really interesting question from the D-Side Sixth Form in Wales, because they want to know if the House of Lords itself would have to approve a motion in Parliament to remove the House of Lords, which is quite an interesting question. Lord Anderson, I wonder if you have
The answer
any
is
thoughts on
no.
this.
We could delay that decision, I think, for 13 months, but under the Parliament Acts, the Commons, in the end, would have their way. The government would have to introduce the bill in 2 successive sessions of Parliament, but if we continued to be truculent, we could be overridden, and quite right too.
There we go, that answers that one. Thank you for that. So we'll move on to some questions now about the panel's more personal experiences. And this is from Southfield School for Girls in Kettering. And they'd like to know, in your time as a member of the House of Lords, what's been the most memorable bill that you've been involved in scrutinising and why? I'll have to ask for a really quick answer from each of you for this one. So perhaps we'll go from this side. So Natalie, would you like to go first?
I'll start off with the genetic technology (precision breeding). Oh no, it is not. That's my addition. Bill, now Act. And it really demonstrated that we need many more scientific people in Parliament, because debate essentially was between 3 people. It was quite technical, and even the House of Lords was really lacking the technical knowledge to properly debate that bill and the issues around it.
Thank you. Lord Anderson?
Could choose so many. Overseas Operations Bill, question of whether soldiers should have immunity for crimes they commit in foreign countries when they're at war. I had objections to this. The amazing thing was to find out that those objections were shared by the most senior soldiers and sailors, the admirals, the field marshals that we have in this place. And an unlikely coalition of people caused the Commons in the end to back down. That was a very inspiring experience.
Thank you. Lord Hayward?
The Ballot Secrecy Act, as it now is, which I introduced into the House of Lords, and it became the first private members' bill in 4 years from the Lords to become legislation, and it received all party support from day one, and effectively it comes into operation at the voting when local elections take place next May, and it gives the powers to presiding officers to stop effectively men standing over women telling them how to vote. It was an equalities piece of legislation which we thought we'd achieved 150 years ago, but the presiding officers didn't have the power, so we changed the law.
I have been part of some extraordinary debates during those pieces of legislation, and one of which was the Illegal Migration Bill Now Act. And there is a member here called Alf Dubbs, who I love. And you should all love him and you should all know his name. He is 91. You would not know that to look at him. And he was kinder transport. He was put on a train by his parents in the 1930s to flee the Nazis from the Czech Republic and arrived here. He became a member of Parliament. He became head of the Refugee Council. His lived experience of being a child refugee is unquestionable. And he can talk about that with a level of authority that he never talks about his own story, he always talks about other people's, but you can't question him for a second on it, nor should anybody. And hearing him, having the privilege of hearing him challenge some of the worst aspects of recent legislation has been a true honour and privilege.
Thank you very much. So this next question is from Rushmead Academy in Leicester, and they would like to know what aspect of your work, and we've discussed all different aspects of the House of Lords work today, do you find most rewarding? So quite a difficult one, I think. Perhaps let's go the other way this time. Maybe Baroness Anderson would like to start.
So I'm a whip, which means that I have, it's really silly language, so I have a flock. Because you do, right? So it means that I have a group of members of the House of Lords that are in my party that I am responsible for talking to on a regular basis, and then encouraging them to turn up to vote and then vote the right way. And some of those people it is a privilege to get to be able to support them doing their work. And that I find very rewarding in here.
Thank you.
I think the ability to work with other people who are specialists in your own field is the element of the work here that is truly rewarding. I cited just now the Ballot Secrecy Act. I could look at any number of other things where you'd find, as David Anderson said just now, common cause on an issue, and you realise that actually in very large number of circumstances it's cross-party, and you can then pursue it. And because you are a member of the House of Lords and don't have the constituency pressures, which I used to have when I was an MP, you can go into so much more detail than you could when you were a member of the House of Commons.
Thank you. Lord Anderson?
It's getting a bill amended, and it's all the people you have to work with. The people out in the country that have seen something wrong and have communicated that to you, the fellow crossbenchers who you try the ideas on and see whether they think it might fly, engaging with the opposition parties, trying to get their support and their commitment, and then finally getting into the room with the minister, hopefully from a position of strength, and getting them to see the force of what you have to say. I love the human side of that, the range of different people that you interact with, and on every bill it's a different bunch of people.
And I would say, for me, it's bringing a side of an argument that I know if I wasn't there, it wouldn't come up. A classic example of this is there is a broadly across the rest of the House consensus that we have to have economic growth in the UK. The Green Party knows that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And I say that to the House, and the whole House goes, oh, we've never heard anyone say that before. I say there should be a universal basic income, that everyone should get a payment every week to meet their basic needs. And I actually had a Department of Work and Pensions minister who used to see me in the corridor and go, "Don't say UBI, don't say UBI." So it's the chance to actually bring different ideas into a space that so often they haven't been heard before.
Thank you very much. Right, so time for a final question from Corby Sixth Form.
There's been a lot of talk recently within UK government of reform, and obviously that includes some people saying that they want to scrap the House of Lords and replace it with an elected body, which we've touched on already. My question is, how feasible do you think that is? How likely is it that we see a future of UK government that has either no upper body or an elected one?
Thank you. Right, who'd like to start on that one? Yes, please.
Well, it could be done. It would probably use a lot of political capital. There have been quite a lot of small changes already, some of them not so small. We didn't have life peerages until 1958. We didn't have the ability to retire until 2014, and now about 20 of us retire every year. But we could achieve much more than that. It would be possible to remove a second chamber, but I think you've got to think very carefully about what you're going to do with the Commons before you get rid of the Lords, because as I think we've all agreed, the Commons at the moment is not as efficient a scrutinising chamber as it could be. Meg Russell, who is a great scholar of the Constitution and in particular of Parliament, has done a study of second chambers across the world. I think she's found 84 countries that have second chambers. About half of those, incidentally, are not wholly elected. They have some people who are appointed. And what she says is that second chambers mean second thoughts. And if you like evidence-based policy making, then you like them. That's why I rather hope we're going to keep a second chamber in this country, because I think we do add value.
I think, I'm not going to ask the room to answer this survey, but if you went out and surveyed 100 people on the street outside, I think virtually all of them would say our politics is broken. And that's not really surprising, given the fact that we haven't really reformed how this Constitution of Westminster works. We've created the Senate in Wales, we've created the Scottish Parliament, both of which are proportional representation elected bodies. But we haven't changed. The last really big change here was women getting the vote, and that was 100 years ago. What I would say is, rather than this place deciding what a future looks like, I would like to see a People's Constitutional Convention, a People's Assembly, a representative group of people to get together and say, how should we govern ourselves? Make that a big national conversation, and that should be the framework that creates a modern, functional, democratic constitution.
Just because the Labour Party policy was touched on, it is the policy of the Labour Party to do significant reform of the House of Lords. It has been the policy of the Labour Party to scrap the House of Lords since the Labour Party existed. So it's still here, but for all the reasons you talked about, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, and how the balance and the constitutional framework, and you can't review one end without reviewing the other. But there is absolutely, and I'm the newbie here, but there is a huge amount that needs to change, some of which we touched on, how committees work, how people are appointed. There is a huge amount. There is also some stuff that is just completely unjustifiable, and that does include the hereditary peers. So there's lots of things that need to be fixed and could be done. I think you're right. There are lots of reports the House itself has put forward that a future government will need to adopt.
Thank you very much. Right, that brings us to our final question in today's event, and it's from Sunderland College, and they would like to know, in the panel's opinion, which member has had the greatest impact on British politics in the last century. So, really difficult question, but I am going to have to ask for a very short answer from each of you.
Member of the House of Lords or the member of the House of Commons?
I'm going to say the House of Lords, but if anyone really can't think of one, then we can go for the House of Commons. Oh, you've got one, excellent. Right, so we'll start with Ruth. Would you like to go first?
Oh, so I read... Okay, so I have been told then, because this is, there are lots of people who you can name who have had huge impact. I'm going to be quite cheeky, because there was a member, so I'm going to say Churchill, because he sat in the House of Lords while he was Prime Minister when the House of Commons was bombed. So he was in both places, but he spoke from us. But I think you need to look at politics in the round, because this building doesn't work independently of each other. The two chambers work to deliver change for the country, and we have had transforming politicians that have changed our framework, from people like Barbara Castle, but also Nye Bevan and Ernie Bevin and Attlee and Blair, and I'm even going to say Thatcher, and Harold Wilson, I can't let her be the last one, who have made huge changes to our country that we still appreciate every day.
Thank you.
I wouldn't disagree with any of those lists, but if I'm going back to the subject I touched on just now about and dealing specifically with the Lords, I think the David Steele, in terms of legislation amending aspects of this House, very important. Interestingly enough, looking forward, I actually think that the appointment of David Cameron as a member of this House will change the perception of the Lords probably for the next decade.
Thank you.
I'm going to mention another Liberal Democrat, perhaps a bit controversially because his career here ended in very difficult circumstances, but I'm going to mention Lord Leicester, Anthony Leicester. In the 1960s, he worked in the US civil rights movement. He brought that back in the 70s, worked for Roy Jenkins, and was one of the framers of our race equality and our sex equality legislation. Then as a backbencher in the House of Lords, year after year after year, he pushed for a Human Rights Act. And he did it when people thought that was an eccentric and ridiculous thing to do. But in the end, he saw it onto the statute book, and he didn't stop there. He agitated for rights, birth control, abortion rights in Northern Ireland, and he finished off by reforming our libel laws so that people don't get such ridiculous damages for libel. So in terms of what a backbencher can achieve over a period of 40, 50 years, for me, he is in a league of his own.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've covered lots of interesting names already, but I'm going to have to mention someone across both houses, which is Betty Boothroyd, who was the first female speaker in the House of Commons, and an utterly formidable character. And what we actually need, coming back to the question about a 50-50 Parliament, women in Parliament, we've had lots of extraordinary women who've had to be extraordinary to function down both ends. What we need is a world in which a woman who's just as ordinary as the most ordinary bloke actually gets to be in this place and gets to have a voice. But that doesn't work that way now, and it needs to.
Thank you very much. Right, that is all we've got time for today, unfortunately. Thank you so much for our panel for sharing all your insights there, and from our Corby Sixth Form audience, thank you all so much for joining us, and to all of you for watching and for submitting such fantastic questions. We'd really love to know what you thought about today's session, and do keep an eye on our website for loads more opportunities coming up from the Learn with the Lords programme. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.